My name is Larry Gostin. I'm the ONeill Professor of Global Health Law and the Faculty Director of the ONeill Institute for National and Global Health Law, and I'd like to add my welcome to all. I've spent much of my life with one foot in the camp of science and health and the other in law, and so it's particularly nice for me to see the nice little marriage going on today. I also wanted to add my warm congratulations to Roger Glass and the Fogarty International Center. It's just been a wonderful 40 years, and we at Georgetown are awfully proud to be partnering with you and celebrating all you've done for the health of the world. It's really been a model for all of us to admire. I now have the pleasure of introducing our speakers, before I do that, I did want to apologize that Allyn Taylor is not able to make it. We were actually at a meeting the last 2 days where the ONeill Institute hosted the Milbank Memorial Fund and the Task Force for Child Survival and Development, looking at human resource issues and the international migration of nurses and physicians, particularly from the south to the north. But Allyn's become ill, and so is to be here. But what I will do is introduce our two speakers. I'll be speaking first. I've already mentioned who I am. The second speaker is going to be Dr. Gaudenz Silberschmidt. We've become good friends just in a few weeks. I was in a meeting of the Graduate Institute of International Development, and we were there with the Director General of the World Health Organization, and since that time he's been back here and has visited us at ONeill. He's in the United States as a visiting fellow for the Center for Strategic and International Studies in their Global Health Policy Center. And he's also the head of international affairs in the Swiss Federal Office of Public Health, where at the Assistant Secretary level, he really masterminds much of what the Swiss government does on problems in international health, and we're very proud to have him. He's been a very member of the World Health Community, was instrumental in working on the international health regulations at WHO, and currently, along with Ilona Kickbush and a number of others, are very interested in a proposal that the World Health Assembly is considering for Committee C of the World Health Assembly, and so it's a great pleasure to invite you and to welcome you here. Our second speaker is also a friend, but a much older friend. I've known Derek for a long, long time. Derek Yach is the Vice President for Global Health Policy at PepsiCo, and he chairs their Global Human Sustainability Task Force. He's had a long and distinguished career in global health that is second to none. At Yale, he chaired their division on global health, and at the World Health Organization, he's held many hats, including being in Gro Brundtland's cabinet and working on chronic diseases, and I think most famously, and the reason why we all admire him so much is that he determinedly and with others, but as a leader, helped bring about the Framework Convention on Global Health. No, that's my proposal. That's your next job. Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So thank you. I'm going to begin the conversation, and what I thought I might do is really use this occasion. It's actually quite fortuitous because we have a new president, President-elect Obama, and as in my meeting the other day, yesterday, when all of our friends from around the world were there, they said, it's now cool to be an American. And so I thought, I hadn't thought of it that way. And they even said, from Africa and Europe that their sons and daughters thought, oh, Dad, you're going to America. That's great. And that wasn't happening. President-elect Obama has said some things about international development assistance for health. I don't know, Gaudenz, whether you're going to talk about the audacity of hope, but he recently sent me a few statements from our president-elect in that book. But he didn't speak about international development assistance for health during the campaign. There were other factors, predictably health care reform in the United States. Less predictably was the financial crisis, but it happened and it engulfed the campaign, and it will likely engulf his early months and maybe even years in office. But President-elect Obama does have quite a credible and a helpful policy that we need to get him to talk more about precisely on this issue. And so what I thought I might do in celebration of Fogarty's 40th anniversary is to provide you with a wish list of what are the top 10 things that President Obama should do in terms of international development assistance for health. But before I do that, I want to say why it is so important that international development assistance is a high priority of the United States government in partnership with governments and civil society and the private sector throughout the world. I think if one wants to look at U.S. engagement in health, one needs to start, of course, with PEPFAR. Both then Senator Obama and Senator McCain were both sponsors and strong supporters of PEPFAR, and it's very likely that President Obama will continue the strong advocacy for it. I had the privilege of being in the White House during the signing of PEPFAR, a $48 billion authorization over 5 years. And it was no question an historic event, bipartisan. The President got a great deal of credit, I think well-deserved, for that initiative. And this is what President Bush said: there is no way to quantify PEPFAR's greatest achievement, the spread of hope. And spreading of hope is in our moral interests because to whom much is given, much is required. It's a good sentiment, and PEPFAR has some inspiring targets. Treat 3 million people, prevent 12 million new infections, care for 12 million people, including 5 million orphans and vulnerable children. But nonetheless, even with PEPFAR, the United States does devote a relatively small proportion of its gross national income, only 0.16%, to official development assistance, which puts us last or near last among our fellow G8 countries and pretty low on the totem pole for OECD countries. The one campaign actually ranks the U.S. last in aid effectiveness, tied with Italy. And we've also heard from Jim Kim and others about policies and practices that can cut against our global aid investment, like agricultural subsidies, and I might add also recruitment activities for in Africa and other developing countries for nurses and other scarce health workers. This is quite important because it's a reverse brain drain and cuts across. We recently worked at the ONeill Institute with Academy Health to develop a code of practice among recruiters that said, among other things, the aspirational goal of not recruiting in one of the 56 countries that have chronic acute shortages of healthcare workers as designated by WHO, and the State Department wrote to the Washington Post objecting to it. And so we need to think, as Sally Benatar said, more broadly about how we think about global health and our commitment to it. The United States health assistance, in my view, stands at a crossroad. Hopefully, the money that's authorized will be allocated even with this financial crisis. The question arises, will it provide opportunities to fulfill basic human needs, sustainable capacity-building support in line with poor country priorities, or will it do less than it needs? So the first question I want to ask today is why international development is in the United States and other developed countries' national interests. Part of the answer we already know, and it's been put forward by the State Department and others, which is the idea of the global movement of pathogens. SARS, we're very aware of it with a potential future pandemic, influenza. And infectious diseases clearly know no borders, and our engagement in capacity building in terms of infectious diseases around the world clearly make it in our national interests to provide that kind of capacity. And of course, the newly reenacted international health regulations at WHO do require capacity building in every country, and they also have the aspirational and hopefully enforceable goals of international cooperation to help poor countries gain that capacity. It's less well known or understood about why chronic diseases are a global issue, but they are increasingly global. And the way I try to explain this, and not just in terms of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, but also in terms of obesity and sedentary lifestyle. Go to any city in the world, whether it's London, Tokyo, Johannesburg, Washington, Paris, and put yourself in the middle of an urban area of that city and do a 360-degree turn, and what you will see is pretty much the identical thing, all caused by the global trade and marketing of goods. You'll see Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, Johnny Walker Whiskey. If you're in the U.S., you'll also might see gambling, porn shops, or gunshots. Maybe actually both, now that I think about it. And so it's clear that chronic diseases also have global dimensions, and no state acting on its own can solve either the problem of infectious or chronic diseases. We need clearly to have international cooperation and collaboration, just like we do with climate change. This is no less true than for health. We also have an enlightened self-interest, of course. SARS or zoonotic diseases like foot and mouth disease or mad cow disease clearly have large economic replications, as does avian influenza at the moment. So from a self-interested point of national security, economic security, trade and commerce, global health is clearly in our national interests. Now, it may very well be that we tend to do global health because we think that we're helping less powerful, more marginalized economies, lower income countries, for example, in Africa, parts of Latin America and Asia. But the same cannot be said about Eurasia, which has enormous geostrategic importance in the United States, with 60% of the world's population, 4 massive armed forces with nuclear capabilities, and yet health in those regions can be perilous to our detriment. Think about a child in maternal health in Russia with the reverse, one of the only major economies where you have a lowering of life expectancy. An alarmingly high proportion of children born in Russia will have and will grow up with severe disabilities. Or in China, where one out of every 3 smokers in the world live in that country, or in India with its emerging HIV epidemic. So in addition to self-interest, we have an enlightened self-interest in global health. And of course, the third reason is global health diplomacy. It's not a secret. All of us travel around the world. We know that the reputation has not been high in other countries, and that saddens us all. And there's a considerable interest in global health diplomacy as a way to reflect the true value, genuine feelings of the American people, as evidenced, I think, by PEPFAR. Health can be an important instrument of foreign trade and security policy. Development assistance can promote our values and our image by demonstrating our clear commitment to the global common good, which is considerably important. Global health diplomacy is not only important for projecting our values, but it also shows our engagement with the world, because if we're going to do true global health diplomacy, we have to form collaborative relationships. We have to recognize the rule of law and the rule of international law. We have to be true, full working partners with intergovernmental organizations, other states, NGOs, the private sector. And also, global health diplomacy can be a tool of economic opportunity, educational opportunity, and improve the status of women. Just imagine, for example, if we were to invest in the education and career development of nurses working in human resource poor communities in Africa, what we could do just in terms of providing those kinds of clear opportunities for women and their families in that setting. So health is a collective good, but just as important as it being a collective good, we need, for global health diplomacy's sake, to spend particularly the needs of the most disadvantaged people, the world's least healthiest people. Social justice and our sense of our American values for social justice demand no less. So in summary, the concept of global health diplomacy has never been well defined, but if you ask me, it says that it reflects our views about trade, security, commitment to the common global collaboration and multilateralism, a focus on social justice and the human rights of the most disadvantaged people in the world. I was going to, at our meeting in Geneva, there was a very interesting conversation about how the United States has projected its global diplomacy and how China has done it. And I wish I had time to really reflect on this, but maybe we can talk about it in question time. But China has done in Africa, they've been much less attentive to values questions like democracy, political accountability and transparency, which are so dear to us, and I think rightfully so and should be dear to us. But they focused instead on basic infrastructure in that region, and for better or worse. I'm not reflecting positively or negatively on it. They've made great diplomatic inroads in that continent for that reason. Whereas we, in terms of projecting our values of democracy, anti-terrorism, have not done as well in terms of our ability to influence. Now, I think that a combination of these two are right. I don't think that either China or the U.S. is right, but I think there are elements in both. That is, I think for us to focus on basic health systems and public health infrastructure them to focus much more on democracy, transparency, political accountability. Now, that would be a good marriage. So the question is, what I've tried to demonstrate is that global health diplomacy is in the United States' interest, and I think evidently so. And so the question is, what should President Obama do as his top 10 priorities in international development assistance for health? I recognize that these have not been politically salient, and I also recognize that in our financial crisis, they may be difficult. But as Margaret Chan said just a week or so ago at WHO, the financial crisis may provide an opportunity, and we should see it as an opportunity. So these top 10 views, I'm only going to give you the headlines because I don't have time to do more. The ONeill Institute's writing a report on this, and I do have a shorter article in the Hastings Center available. Number 3, appoint a cabinet-level official on international development assistance for health that cuts across multiple sectors. It was very clear from the discussion this morning that health is not just a matter for HHS. Health is a matter that goes through the entire cabinet. It concerns foreign affairs, obviously health and social services, agriculture, energy, the environment, and the like. This is not too dissimilar to a statement that Mark Dybel made when he was recently here at the ONeill Institute, where he said that he would never trade having PEPFAR in the Department of State because it's better to have the Secretary of State argue for PEPFAR in the Cabinet than having the HHS Secretary do it. But in any case, I think the recognition of some cabinet-level appointment across is very important. And I take as my model, although it's an imperfect model, the recent European Union statement of health in all policy. The CDC is very interested in, but it's the idea that all of our policies affect health and that we shouldn't confine it only to the HHS Secretary. Second, fulfill the pledge to devote 0.7% of our gross national income per annum to official development. Just recently in Japan, the G8 leaders reaffirmed this commitment, and we fall very low on that list. 3, focus on and meet the basic survival needs of the world's least healthiest people. That is, rather than focusing on high technology, first make it as a priority basic survival needs. Now, basic survival needs is a term that I've used in relation to my proposal for a framework convention on global health, but you don't need to adopt my term. The Millennium Development Goals get at this, or UNDP's human security approach also get at this. But what it involves: sanitation and sewage, pest control, clean air and water, adequate food and nutrition, tobacco reduction, essential medicines, and the like. And as the great British epidemiologist Geoffrey Rose once said, the reason we want to focus on these things is not because they're a dramatic rescue, or not because they're high science and high technology, but because they represent the major cause and death around the world, and that's why we should focus on them. 4th is to strengthen health systems. The health systems approach is extremely important. Laboratories, human resources, data systems, primary care, which WHO has recently reinvigorated, and the public health infrastructure are all critically important elements. 5th, reverse the brain drain. WHO suggests that there's a 4.3 million person shortage of healthcare workers around the world. There are 56 countries, mostly in the Caribbean and sub-Saharan Africa with critical shortages. The World Health Assembly, with the O'Neill Institute's help, is currently proposing a code of practice for the international migration and recruitment of nurses, physicians, and other healthcare professionals. And this is something where we could make a dramatic difference, because many of these nurses and doctors and pharmacists and others are coming from developing or low and income countries to the United States and Europe. 6 is focus on maternal, newborn, and child health. It's unconscionable, I think, that more than 500,000 women each year in pregnancy and more than 500,000 children die from preventable diseases like diarrhea, pneumonia, and malaria. And there's much that we can do to provide neonatal and postnatal care, childhood vaccines, nutrition, oral hydration, rehydration, inexpensive life-saving interventions. 7th, create fair rules for trade for low and middle income countries. This was discussed at our panel earlier. 2 prominent examples would be the dichotomy between health and trade and the WTO and the TRIPS agreement and access to essential medicines. And then secondly would be agricultural subsidies, not only in the U.S. but also in the European Union. We have a $300 billion subsidy that really deserves to be addressed, because it directly harms farmers and their ability in poor countries to maintain their own livelihood. And in the past, we've even had rules that are being softened but still there, where we actually have to buy our food here and send it overseas to Africa rather than buy local food from local farmers. It clearly doesn't make sense, and people tell me that we need to have the political lobby of the farm industry on our side, otherwise we wouldn't get food aid. But as a humanist, I just cannot accept that as a principled answer to that question. 8th, the United States must do more in terms of collaboration and coordination with multiple stakeholders across the world. We've been quite phobic about international relations. Just an example, when I gave my talk last week at WHO about the Framework Convention on Global Health, the U.S. attaché got up, asked the first question, and basically said, "No more treaties over my dead body." We have been very adverse to international approaches, and we need to do better. There's fragmentation and duplication of services, and it's necessary for us to work collectively with respect for national and international law in health, the environment, climate change, and food security. These, I believe, to be the great defining issues of our time: global health, environment, climate change, and food security. 9th, we want to have accountability, transparency, and monitoring in global health. This is true at the international level, at WHO. It's true at the state level, both developed, and also true with large, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And then 10th, agree to fair terms of international cooperation for global health. There are many ideas on the table. Committee C is one. Our own proposal for a framework convention on global health would ask the international community to develop targets and objectives, build capacity, set priorities, engage stakeholders, evaluate and monitor, and try to incentivize all sectors from the bottom up. Effective global health governance, in my view, could dramatically improve life prospects for millions of people and diminish our collective vulnerabilities. And that, I believe, is an ideal that President-elect Obama and the United States collectively as a people should pursue. Thank you very much. Gaudenz is next.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for your inspiring words. I am referring to what Jim Kim said earlier. I'm a former NGO activist turned into a health diplomat, and I would say you still need to take risk even as a health diplomat. I've seen it in IHR negotiation to mediate compromise needs to take risk. I've seen it in negotiation of the Intergovernmental Working Group, Public Health, Innovation, Intellectual Property, to mediate between pharma and NGOs. It needs taking risk, and I think I'm going to take risk also today. First, as I think the only non-US resident to speak to a US audience. Secondly, to present a proposal in my own name, which is not a Swiss government proposal, but which is in my own name. Thirdly, to do so in front of my boss, the Swiss Secretary of Health, Thomas Zeltner, who is that mentioned Fogarty Fellow. And I must say, if all the 4,000 have turned at that level, 4,000 is already a lot. But that gives me the possibility also to congratulate Fogarty for your anniversary. I wanted, finally, as an introduction, I was very happy to hear the idea that global health is not only the health of the poor, but has a definite link of your national health policy, of your neighboring health policy, of industrialized nations, of global public goods for health, and of health of the poorest, starts to make its way. I'm profoundly convinced that this must be the global health approach we have to take. I'm presenting to you that idea of a Committee C of the World Health Assembly, covering 4 points. First, to look in the mandate of the Constitution of the World Health Assembly, knowing that there are former top officials who will be able then to tell me why it shouldn't be WHO or why it should be. Secondly, just an overview of the main players, and there are so many you can never cover all of them. Thirdly, to look into existing coordination mechanisms, and finally, to look at what we are proposing with that Committee C. In recent years, we have heard it enough. Health has become more important, both domestically and in international affairs for most countries. Focusing on the international level, we have heard enough, the increase of financing from 2 to 12 billion, treatment reaching more people. The health status is better. We don't often forget, yes, we have a lot of poor, but health status worldwide is improving, but a lot remains to be done. According to its constitution, WHO is the main player of global health. Not everybody will agree that it's in reality. According to its constitution, it is so. It has universal membership with 190 states. And if you take a careful look to the 1948 constitution of WHO, it's surprisingly modern. It was established with the objective of the attainment by all peoples of the highest possible level of health. The definition of health as the highest attainable standard of physical, mental and social well-being, and not the mere absence of disease, is still very modern. It's the lead agency. Article 2A mandates WHO to act as the directing and coordinating international health work. Article 2B asks WHO to establish and maintain effective collaboration with the United Nations, specialized agencies, government health administrations, professional groups, and such other organizations as might be deemed appropriate. Probably the drafters didn't realize at that point that such other organizations will become the main factor 60 years later. WHO is functioning according to the one code principle, which in my view is adequate in the multipolar world of the 21st century. When we heard in the previous panel from Elias Zaruni how many people have to be trained, he was saying it as if, I know that he didn't mean it in that way, but as if the US would do alone that job. The EU, Switzerland not a member, but nevertheless the EU has already now a bigger GDP and is devoting more to health, international health, than what's done from the US. China and India in the next 20 years will follow us at the same GDP. The world is turning multilateral, and we have to do the job together, nevertheless needing the leadership and needing the leadership of the new US administration also. WHO has an operative and a normative function. The normative function is mostly used in so-called soft laws, resolutions, which are morally binding but not legally binding. There are two notable exceptions. They were already mentioned with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. WHO was using its lawmaking power in the classical sense of a global convention. In the international health regulations, WHO was using a unique power of deciding on regulations which are as legally binding as a convention, but which to apply to all member states without needing ratification. So it's an opting out and not an opting in process, which is a unique power in the international sphere and in international law, and it is used in IHR, in the international health regulations. I'm here not going to discuss the shortcomings which definitely also exist in WHO constitution, just to mention one, the modalities of electing the regional directors, where you subordinate an elected official to another elected official, which has always conflict inherent to it. In my view, under the leadership of Dr. Margaret Chan, WHO has currently also the leadership trusted by most member states and by other international partners. And WHO can be strengthened with no need to change its constitution. But why would WHO need strengthening? This leads me to my second point, the actors on global health. Global health governance has become complex and crowded. For the normative function, WHO is unique. For its operative function, it shares the function with many other actors, some of them having significantly larger budget. Within the UN family, I would mention UNAIDS, UNICEF, the UN Development Programme, the World Population Fund, and many others. Other international organizations such as the World Bank, the Global Funds for AIDS, Tuberculosis, Malaria, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, UNITAID, and again many others. All the bilateral work, most notably PEPFAR and what the US government is doing, but also many other bilateral activities. Philanthropies, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and many other foundations following. Private company, be it the pharmaceutical industry, the food industry, or other main industry. NGOs such as Médecins Sans Frontières and other activists. All of them are major global health players, and it's a lot of them. This makes coordination absolutely paramount. Coordination means not uniform doing everybody the same, but that there needs to be a meaningful interaction in global health governance. Where else than in the World Health Assembly could we have an effective global health governance? That leads me to my third point on mechanism of coordination. I think at the country level there is a lot of coordination going on. Not everything works, but it starts to go in the right direction, and we should make the current mechanism working and not adding other mechanisms. There is the One UN process, there is the Paris Declaration of Aid Effectiveness, and other processes. There is a question of implementation and not adding another layer. The global level, there is the so-called Health 8, H8, which are the leaders of the 8 global health agencies: Gates Foundation, Gavi, Global Fund, UNAIDS, UN Population Fund, UNICEF, WHO, and the World Bank. Speaking with people within the organization, you hear that at the top executive level, this starts to work quite well. Working together and at the operative level is more difficult, understandably so because each of them have their governance mechanism. Each of them have to report to another, are accountable to another governance mechanism in their organization. Finally, also to mention the International Health Partnership, a country-driven initiative to scale up coverage towards reaching the MDG. All these efforts are welcome, but they have some shortcomings. They do not have the legitimacy, the democratic structure and transparency of the World Health Assembly, where even the poorest countries are represented on equal footing than the richest country. They focus on the country level of developing country. This is necessary but not sufficient. We currently live, and we often forget it, in a world where 2/3 of humanity lives neither in an affluent nor in a classical developing country, but in an emerging economy. And I think global health has, in the operative side, we have to focus on the poorest, while on the normative side, we also have to take into account the health needs of emerging economy and of the rich countries. So we have to look at all of us. Finally, coming to the proposal of the Committee C, let me explain it what it is. Currently, the World Health Assembly has two main committees. Committee A works for technical matters, Committee B on administrative and financial matters. The committee we are proposing would be a Committee C. I know internally it was before used as the coffee break committee, which will remain important and where a lot of negotiation is going on. We are slightly more formal in what we propose as Committee C, where we want to bring together the mentioned major actors together with the Member State and WHO Secretariat to the same table. Making one example, how can we really debate access to medicine without having industry, without having NGO, without having the main funders as Gates or Unitate at the same table when we negotiate it? A major challenge will be to find a balance between coordination and the full respect of the independence of the organization and of their internal decision-making power. It is not about subordinating everybody to WHO or to anybody else. This would just not work. It's a question of providing a platform for effective coordination between the actors. What we propose is that the actors independently take commitments and that these commitments could be annexed to a resolution debated and passed by the Committee C. So a balance between independent action and annexing. Obviously, this would lead to negotiations of the modalities. Yes, we annex if you agree to buy into a coordination mechanism. A Committee C would not replace the existing coordination mechanism. Indeed, the H8 could well serve as its secretariat to prepare the debate, but then you have to bring it to the open and not just have it in the small rooms, but bring it to the open to have the transparency and legitimacy. I'm well aware that there might be many other proposals coming, and I even do hope that many other proposals to improve global health governance will come, but I'm firmly convinced that we have to start a thorough debate on how to improve global health governance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, and wonderful to be here, and thank you to Larry and colleagues at Georgetown. Gaudenz mentioned that he had the problem of having his boss glaring at him. Well, I have even more problems. I have my teacher, Solly Benneter, glaring at me, my teacher from many decades ago. I have the chairman of the work I was doing at WHO, of our executive board, Thomas Zeltner, the same person, glaring at me, and I have other ex-board members, Tom Novotny, sitting up there also glaring at me, wondering, first of all, what I've done moving from the public to the and secondly, wondering what I could contribute to a debate on global health, which has, except for the last comments, highlighted the fact that maybe the private sector has something to contribute. I take my inspiration for a lot of my work from Ibsen's play, The Enemy of the People. And those who don't recall it from high school, it was a play written 120 years ago, set in Norway. The hero or villain, depending on which way you look at him, is the doctor of a small town who identifies the fact that the local spa and pool is contaminated by something causing ill health. It's a major source of revenue to the town. And he has to tell the mayor, his brother, that you've got to close the pool down for a long period of time, clean it up, and of course there'll be a loss of finances, but health must take precedent over the local economy. And this hero, from a scientific point of view, not to be subject to a number of pressure, and I'll come back to him later. But I think it's our role wherever we sit in public health, whether you're sitting in a UN agency, whether you're sitting in a scientific body, whether you're sitting in an academic institution, or where I'm sitting now inside a corporation, to remain true to your training as a public health professional with certain ethics and values, and be willing to say that the I think particularly now, during this time of change, we have the opportunity for that level of truth to have an impact. There's no question that the next few years are going to be profoundly different. Of course, we're all thrilled to see the potential of dramatic transition in this country. We know, though, that this is happening at a time of unprecedented collapse of the financial system. The impact of that, the ripple effect throughout the economies of the world, the fact that trillions of dollars of investment have been wiped off out of the share markets, have really exposed very deep vulnerabilities in an era of unprecedented interdependence. It's highlighted the failures of appropriate vigilance, and it's also highlighted the failure of the regulatory system. I had a chance to hear some of the perspectives of some of the leaders of business, finance, government, and academics recently in Dubai with your president, President De Goya, who chaired a number of sessions at the World Economic Forum in Dubai just over the weekend. Interestingly, in his summary of the weekend, he highlighted the important moral imperative to develop the potential of all individuals as being the highest priority of what we need to do now, despite the immediate face, the importance of looking long-term. And I mention that because here was a president of a major university with a known deep commitment to values and moral issues, making a very powerful statement that was echoed by many of the leading business community in the room. I mention that because that's not something that often academia, research, and government is all that aware of. Over the last 6 months, in fact, we've heard statements by Bill Gates questioning the way we define capitalism. We've had our own CEO, Indra Nooyi, constitutes a good company, and that the cost of business of being a good company in the future requires giving attention equally to financial performance as to social purpose. We're starting to talk about the notion of a social business, which would have an impact in reducing MDGs within an entrepreneurial spirit at the local level. All of these approaches stress the need for negotiated solutions, for multi-sectoral approaches that are aligned with our values. And what was interesting in Dubai was how the education people, the agriculture, finance, technology, health, were all talking in that sort of language, really expressing a ferment of change that if we capture right, we could be using for global health. That's suggesting that we do need to look at solutions in a different way, and we need to bring players on board in a different way. So let's just turn to the reality of where we are. We believe very strongly in science-based approaches. Does science really play a role in health policy? Let's just look at some of the numbers. The latest data, looking at the dollar investment in deaths by the 4 major agencies investing in health, the World Bank, the Global Fund, the US government, and PEPFAR, suggest a value of $1,000 per death investment in AIDS, $1,000, $3 per death for non-communicable diseases. You might say, well, you know, those non-communicable diseases are actually happening in people at the end of their productive life. So, you know, put our money there. So maybe that would cut the figure to 500. Maybe that would cut the figure instead of to $3 per death today. Maybe you could up a bit. But how do you explain the figure on nutrition of $20 per death from a nutrition-related death? That this is the U.S. government, the World Bank, the Gates Foundations, their of how investment. Clearly, we are not placing our investments on the burden of the disease, but many other factors. So why would you have a discrepancy between $20 per death for a nutrition-related disease and $1,000 you're willing to invest for an AIDS death? Now, I'm not saying which is the right figure, and I would hope we would get to $1,000 per death investment for all. And if we go to the 0.7 figure that Larry's talking about, we probably could get close to it if all countries went there. So I would not want to suggest that we lower the figure. But it raises profound questions about how has AIDS succeeded where nutrition has failed so terribly? And I would be keen in the discussion to hear a discussion around it, particularly since nutrition is going to bring down the entire MDG capability, and it's going to erode our potential to meet our AIDS goal long term. In this recession, this is going to be a critical failure. What about the effectiveness of interventions? Do we tend to invest in the most cost-effective interventions? Again, I would hesitate to say no, and maybe we need to understand why. Is AIDS treatment more cost-effective than breastfeeding, than under-2 nutrition, than micronutrient fortification of staples, than tobacco tax, than even statins and aspirin? Well, the work by Roger Gostin at the review of major cost-effective interventions suggests we're talking of orders of magnitude difference in the cost-effectiveness of all of those against AIDS treatment. Again, that doesn't suggest you shouldn't be doing AIDS treatment, but if we're at the point of doing AIDS treatment, we should at least be doing all the cost-effective ones that are below it that would have a dramatic, larger impact on MDGs. By now, I'm sure you're rushing to go and read The Enemy of the People and wondering how it ends. Let me go to a third question. Are we using our global capacity fully? I think that it was Bill Clinton, in an edition of Science, believe it or not, about a decade ago, writing in an editorial about the need for us to invest in science, who made the very powerful statement that I've never forgotten, reminding us that brains are globally distributed. Their use is not. What he was referring to was primarily our failure to invest in a science system to tap the knowledge of people around the world, something that Fogarty is deeply involved in, and a dramatic increase in the Fogarty-type approach would be able to expand that. But there's a second dimension to that that has bothered me ever since I started focusing more on nutrition, and that's the fact that we have permanently limited the capability of many of those brains to fulfill their potential because of the impact of nutrition in the first 2 years of life. We really want to talk about this because it has deep societal implications. And maybe what we need to do is to actually transform the way we think of nutrition in terms of physical and linear growth to one that affects brain growth and societal development. The last question, this awkward question I might ask is, do we work together to achieve the best global health outcomes? And I think that Gaudenz has provided a very compelling case for the need to review the range of activities going on. Let me just give you one example of how we are not doing that. There's obviously a food and nutrition crisis in the world. The UN convened a meeting to address this in June, brought together all the UN agencies, drew up a common framework for action, which literally wrote out the role of the multinationals. Now, whether one likes all the products or not, and hopefully some of you do, the fact is that among the major food, retail, agricultural companies, you have some of the most powerful distribution systems, social marketing networks, financial capabilities, business acumen, agricultural training and extension offices. Nestle alone has 600,000 farmers it works with. We probably have tens of thousands. And yet their role was written out of the UN Common Framework. They have made a valiant attempt to try and bring us back at the end, and I'll come back to that. So I would say that while we have an aspiration at this stage to use science, we have an aspiration to work together. We are a long way from achieving it, and I think that is something we need to move forward on. So let me just end off with my two deep experiences of what it actually takes to be doing global diplomacy in two areas. The one being tobacco, of course, the other one being diet and physical. And again, maybe just not talk about the Tobacco Convention in the way that you usually hear it spoken about, but let you know some of the things that happened that maybe you didn't know about and why it really happened. The official stuff has been written. In my personal view, the reason it happened had far more to do with the support of and US agencies and US players than we want to acknowledge. The US has yet to adopt the treaty, and I certainly hope they do. What do I mean by that? I'm referring to the fact that what Jim said earlier, I think, is so vital to think about. When the CDC and the federal agency engage in a global issue, they can make the difference. So did the CDC engage in the Framework Convention? Yes. The reason that we actually had the data on childhood smoking, which moved the governments of the world, was because CDC stepped up to the plate and ran major initiatives. The reason we have many of the scientists working on the tobacco control was, as we started, Roger's colleagues and people at Fogarty Center put in place what I still think is probably a unique Fogarty RFP, where WHO and Fogarty are joint partners in a research effort to address the policy aspects of tobacco control. I wonder how many people realize that the EPA stepped up to the plate and put $500,000 into studying indoor air pollution in China and Poland. That certainly helped out a lot with the Chinese and Polish governments. Or that the Department of Tobacco, Alcohol and Firearms in 2002 convened and funded us to hold a meeting in the United Nations on illicit trade in tobacco that changed the way we look at illicit trade. Of course, it was done partly because of the stories that had come out about Hezbollah smuggling between North Carolina and some of the northern states. But they did it. How many know that the foundation community, often forbidden from funding overseas, provided support in the Chicago conference for people to get training? This is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Or that the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the American Public Health Association, the American Heart Association, and most especially the American Cancer Society put substantial dollars and personal commitment of the leaders behind the Framework Convention. And finally, who knows that a very strange grouping of players who never acknowledged as actually having helped us with the Framework Convention, but perhaps Thomas Zeltner and I fully understand why they did, was Minnesota Blue Cross and Blue Shield, DC law firm in Minneapolis. Now, what did they have to do with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control? Without them, you wouldn't have had the settlement with the tobacco industry that required documents to be placed into the public domain about the way the tobacco industry carried out their work. Those documents Thomas used in chairing a committee reporting to Dr. Brundtland that showed how policy in the past had been subverted. And that document, I believe, and I'm sure many others believe, played a very strong role in making the negotiation process a truly transparent and open one, and led us to the conclusion we did. I mention that because it shows that often the linear process of negotiations that we write about is not the way it happens. It tends to be a much messier process in reality. And as long as you keep your eye fixed on the goal, and we had a very firm, tough boss in Grohol and Brundtland who wanted a treaty within 5 years, even though we told her that international lawyers say you can't put a time frame for an international treaty, it kept us moving at the pace that we wanted. And 10 years after the start of the negotiation, the one thing we lacked is now being put on the table, $500 million by Gates and Bloomberg, who, if you'd asked them 10 years ago, as we did, were not particularly interested. So what does this mean now for our next big challenge in the chronic disease era, diet and physical activity? And I would say the most important lesson to learn is the fact that everything we did in the tobacco treaty needs to be rethought. We excluded industry. We stopped everything we could. We stopped marketing. We stopped a range of smoking in public places. And that was now we have to adopt a new mindset where we need to work with multi-stakeholders. What was very interesting for me was that one of the jobs I had at WHO was to work on the global strategy on diet and physical activity. And in the process, we had to work out what was the role of the private sector. And we listed a lot of things. They included lowering salt, sugar, fat, changing marketing, labeling. It was very easy to do that, and you could write it out of a textbook. What I found interesting was I never knew at the time I'd later be inside a food company. And when I joined, I realized that my job was very simple. It was basically to work on seeing how one can implement what WHO had already agreed to. What I found even more interesting was that increasingly we've had the food industry getting behind those exact prescriptions and saying in an unprecedented letter by the 8 CEOs of the major food companies to the head of WHO that they commit to take actions on each one of those points over the next few years. And this letter came out a few months ago. Let's go back to Gaudenz's point before I end. So let's say that you have the intent of food and retail companies and sports and other companies to work with WHO. What is the mechanism to do that at the moment? And without a formalized process, it'll continue to be a hit-and-miss affair where we're probably making some progress. We can do this as we are in an ad hoc way. But I think the frustration that's felt now that I can see it from the corporate side is that there is a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of intent. What is needed are clear guidance on what in detail does it mean to change the composition for food over what point of time. What in detail is required if we want to have labeling that really affects behavior? How do we really work with governments to boost physical activity levels? And on undernutrition, how do we actually overcome some very deep-set problems that are blocking the food and other industry investing in under-2 nutrition, where they are really fearful of being accused of infringing the Code of Infant Formula? If we found a way around these, I think we'd find a way to open the door to unprecedented interaction. And if what is true from what I can see inside the food industry, I suspect it may be true for the pharmaceutical industry. Let me just end by saying what I think you're all asking. Why on earth should we trust them? Trust the industry. And I think if we move to where we are today, what I find fascinating is that it's not just our CEO and CEOs who are saying we need to think about a good company. It's the investment community who are looking at us. It's the UN Global Compact who are all spelling out very clear metrics which define when they consider a company to be a good company. And when they say that, it has investment decisions that affect the analysts on Wall Street. So we have to start meeting an increasingly rigorous set of criteria. And the problem that we've had in the past is that we haven't included a strong enough public health lens. I would hope that that is the next big challenge. Just for your interest, the hero, a person I thought of, the hero in the play, was run out of the town. His family were basically destroyed by the process. And the aspiration of being the enemy of people and turning it to goodwill didn't happen. I would hope this time round we could find a negotiating forum where you can have an honest discussion about differences and one where you have the opportunity to resolve them and move on so that the people really do benefit. Thank you.
We're running a little bit behind. Why don't we take a few questions, and then we'll ask John to come up and sum up. Thomas.
Well, thanks a lot. And I was mentioned a couple of times, so I dare saying something and asking one question. I'm Thomas Seltner, Secretary of Health in Switzerland, and the boss of Gaudenz, and you have all my good feelings for what you said, and I have been working with Derek for a couple of years. Let me, and second point, you know, it's true. I have been a fellow of the Fogarty, and thank you very much for that. Secondly, I have been working at the Harvard School of Public Health for a couple of years. I am the person I'm here now because I had the chance to do that. And thirdly, saying that many around this globe are thankful to the United States to give that opportunity. And you have a lot of friends and allies actually around the world in that respect. A German newspaper lately wrote, finally we can again love the United States, because generally, actually most countries, most people love this country. One of our favorite poets actually wrote, America, you have it better. And that was the feeling for many, many centuries that in this, or couple of centuries, that in this country there is more freedom than in many other places, and we can start loving you again. But that is all to start.
It's cool to be an American.
Let me, and that is my point. I completely agree with what has been said by Jim Kim, who was leaving right now. We have, at one side, a very important part, which is the NGO activists, which are very undiplomatic very often. And they are extremely important. Nobody mentioned, actually, and that's the reason why I mention it here, the power of the mass media. And to put things on the agenda. Of course, again, sometimes the activists may use that, but I think, to take the example of the U.S., reporting on what happened in New Orleans with the disaster there has changed the way you think about public health. We had the same experience in Switzerland. Then when we had these open drug scenes and everybody saw these, that has helped us bringing through actually a public health perspective. And coming to Derek, I think that one of the major assets of big companies these days is reputation and reputation management. And if they get into difficulty with, because they are attacked by the mass media, they respond immediately because they cannot afford to lose reputation. It's too expensive for them. The question and the point I finally want to make is, please be aware that as U.S., you are one, and it has already, Larry has said it, with China and probably the European Union, you are one of the three empires. And you have, because of that, a major responsibility when it comes to international diplomacy and health diplomacy. And in my view, all starts at home. And you need, and I agree with what you have been saying, you need a better coordination. And the better coordination, I think, within rich countries is between economy and health and public health. And the point I want to make is people in the public health sector needs to know much more how economy works. What is the value of IP and why is IP so important, etc., and how to negotiate within the country. And I would urge that in schools of public health, people learn much more about these questions than on other probably less important things. And the same is very true for the governments. Thank you.
Good. I think I'll just take a few comments and then go to the panel at the very end, since we're short of time. Sally.
Thanks very much, Derek. First, can I say how much I've enjoyed all the presentations this morning? They were really superb. And I would just like Derek to know that if I'm glaring at him, I'm glaring with pride. And I'm delighted that we provided his brain with that early nutrition that allowed him to progress in the way that he has. All the things I want to say have been said, but I want to frame them in a slightly different way, if I may, just to help with clarity to think about them. With regard to global governance, there are a whole range of values that are sort of subterranean that really guide us and determine how we behave. All of those values are necessary, but none of them are sufficient. So let me list them briefly and tell you how I think they should be expanded. The first is that we think of science as the solution to all. Science is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have a whole bunch of science on our shelves that we haven't used, old knowledge, as someone has mentioned before. And we need to look at the social determinants of health as well as focusing on new scientific developments. It would have been very exciting for me if Bill Gates had included something like that amongst his grand challenges and hadn't focused just on the scientific issues. The second value that we have, which we all treasure enormously, is freedom and individualism. And clearly that's of great value to all of us. But it comes at the expense of some lack of focus on solidarity and the public good and the extent to which we're all interconnected. Isaiah Berlin put it very nicely when he said total freedom for the wolves is death for the lambs. We have to temper freedom and individualism with the ideas of solidarity, and that value needs to be promoted much more aggressively than we've promoted it in the past. The other value is money as the bottom line. And the extent to which market forces have become pervasive and consumerism have become pervasive changed the nature of everything in the world, even professional life, to the extent that professionalism is being eroded. We somehow need to place some greater value on, focus on other values such as democracy, and democracy not only within countries, but democracy within the way the global economy is governed and how money is moved around. Fair trade rules, the idea that economic growth is limited. It cannot be limitless, and it cannot be emulated for everybody at the level that you've achieved in the United States. Unless we promote those values, the freedom of transnational companies to move their money around in the hope that they're going to make endless profits will get us nowhere. The fourth value is human rights. Nobody would dispute human rights, but we've had a very narrow vision of human rights, a vision of human rights that's focused on civil and political, that's even been undermined within this nation. So our discussion of moral values needs to go way beyond human rights. First of all, a more expansive version of human rights, but also other moral values, the language of responsibility, the language of caring for other people, the language of empathy. Those are moral languages that must be extended to the language of human rights. And finally, the language of competition, which is vital in a world in which we are striving to do all the things we want to do, has to be extended to a language of cooperation, competition, but competition tempered with cooperation. And in my view, if we were to look at the nutritional problem through that lens, I believe we could solve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just two very quick comments, and then I'd like to wrap up, if I may.
This is short. There's a very big difference between the authorization process and the appropriations process. And it's no coincidence that this issue did not come up, the global health issue was not an issue during this campaign, because there's simply no constituency in this country to drive that issue. So while I think that there is a likelihood that we will get some of that appropriations, I'm not saying we're going to get all the appropriations, and I think it's critically important for people involved in this endeavor to put as much pressure. We have some good people in the House and the Senate. I mean, Howard Berman is a good friend, and Joe Biden is a good friend. But we have to put pressure on, because there are no constituents, and the financial world has changed.
Yes, thank you. Last comment.
Yeah, I was very happy to hear, Derek, you spoke about the issues about corporate responsibility, and I'd like to hear a little bit further about how the corporations are actually valuing this from a social perspective. These are companies with parochial interest of making for the stockholders, and so how would you think that the issue of social responsibility and corporate responsibility can be factored in as a value to ultimately the shareholders?
So that we can hear from John Monahan, do you think you could, each panelist, 30 seconds each, and then I can get John? I do apologize, but I know John is going to have a rich contribution, and I want to make time for it.
I think I just have one point. I think climate change is the major challenge for the energy industry that we've ended up understanding. I was recently at a meeting with Novartis Public Affairs, one of the major Swiss pharma company. They had agreed with me access to medicine is the major issue for the pharma industry, and that I would say, I don't know if you agree, that nutrition and obesity is the major challenge for the food industry. So basically, they have these challenges, and if you take these three industries, two of them have a global health challenge.
In 30 seconds, I think all I can do is say that the seriousness with which a range of companies are taking the need to link financial performance to what is being social responsibility can be seen in terms of the commitments they're making, which are increasingly subject to independent review, and also the fact that the investment community is looking to them at the same time as looking at the bottom line as the decision for whether they should invest or not invest in a company. So the two are being taken deadly seriously, and I can give more details.
Thank you. And now I want to introduce John Monahan. John is the Executive Director of the ONeill Institute for National and Global Health Law. He came to us from the Casey Foundation, and he has very kindly offered to be the rapporteur for our section and close us down. Thank you.
hard task. It's been such a rich and robust discussion all morning. But let me do a couple housekeeping things first. I do want to say that we really appreciate, on behalf of the ONeill Institute, all of you who are able to join us today. This is just the kind of forum that Georgetown wanted the ONeill Institute to help host. We are delighted with our partnership with the Fogarty International Center. It's just been terrific. Second is, and this is something everyone in this room knows, these events don't happen by accident. These events also don't happen by all the people that you're going to hear speaking today. So I do want to take a moment to thank Ann Puderbaugh, Karen Hoffman, and Nalini Anand with the Fogarty International Center, who were really at the beginning and have followed this project all the way through, plus Jeannie Austin, who's a fellow with the ONeill Institute, and Jessica Raper and Meg McWhorter of the President's Office at Georgetown, who really helped pull all these pieces together. So thank you. That's exactly right. Let me say a couple things just in reaction to what I heard today. I mean, I think first thing is the two host institutions, I think with their leaders, actually set up a very nice common ground at the beginning, which I think speaks to the reason why this conference and this symposium made sense. They both are obviously committed in different ways to research and teaching, and it was very interesting to hear them talk about that. But I also thought to hear both Roger and Jack DeGioia talk about the focus of on the ground, where this work meets real people, as being an animating force drives their interest in research and training. And so let me, at the risk of wild oversimplification, suggest sort of three takeaways that I would suggest for the group. First is I think that all panelists, but particularly the first panel, really chewed on what is global health diplomacy, what is its dimensions, and how did it work. And I think we heard that really, I think everyone said in different ways that this was the global health diplomacy understandably mixed health and science considerations in economic security, economics, and the other dimensions of diplomacy. And this is hardly new. As Dr. Kim pointed out, this is from the beginning of global health issues. These issues have been intertwined, and as Jimmy Coker pointed out, they remain in day-to-day work of a diplomat intimately intertwined. So it's not. There's no point in trying to separate. There's no point there's a point of just realizing that they're mixed together. But I think for the purpose of this discussion, a couple key things. One is. It's a question of who's at the table. We heard Dr. Zahoni talk, I think, quite powerfully about the need and the value for local capacity to engage in diplomacy as well as science. Two, to appreciate, as several people said, the role of civil society, even the undiplomatic role of activists who play critically in these. And three, as Derek pointed out, the critical role of the private sector. I mean, I think all of these pieces are part of what is global health diplomacy. I also think it's a rich definition. It's broad. It has lots of stakeholders. But I think that was an unmistakable message from all the panelists for today. Is I thought that in terms of thinking about what the highest priority is going forward, there was a common theme of, again, focusing on the ground where real people meet. I think Dr. Kim talked about how the third D of the Gates Foundation, not just discovery and development, but delivery. What's the science? What's the systems engineering? What are all the different components that make programs work on the ground? And this came up over and over again in my notes. I think, though, there were probably three sub-issues in this area that came out that I think are relevant. One is, if you're focusing on the ground, one is how effective is aid? We heard conversations in various ways. My colleague Larry Gostin talked about it in a number of ways. How does effective? How do we measure that? Two, how do you integrate health and non-health issues? There are a lot of discussion about the question of agricultural subsidies or intellectual property interests. How do you mix? How do you consider the role of health as part of these other economic and diplomatic interests that are out there? And then a third issue is how do you think about education, or as one questioner raised, how do you think about the agricultural extension service equivalent here? How do you go from, as Dr. Glass would say, the gap between knowing and doing? How do you think about that piece of that dimension of it? So in my mind, that's the second piece of the priority here was on the ground. And those are at least three issues that jumped out to me. And then finally, I think everybody here had an action agenda. I think Professor Gostin did a terrific job of stating clearly the case for why it is in America's interest to care about global health, and listing 10 things that I'm sure President Obama will be getting to work on right away. A second thing is I thought Gaudenz laid out a very interesting, practical, real-world opportunity to move from the complexity and the duplication and the lack of coordination that often characterizes global health issues to at least a mechanism to move forward. And then finally, I thought Derek Yach put on the table a really complicated but important set of issues. What does it mean? What do we think about solutions when everybody's at the table? When the private sector with its expertise and delivery systems is in the mix, how does that work? So anyway, I came away thinking that there's an action agenda. So just to summarize, one, a discussion about what does global health diplomacy mean. We heard over and over the priority is on the ground. And third, we had some really concrete ideas about what could be the next steps in that action agenda. And I think unless anybody else has, we promised to get everybody out. But I guess the other thing that wasn't said, and I mean this in I think there was a profound optimism underlying every person who spoke today about the possibilities here. And again, I mean this in the most nonpartisan way possible, but I think there was a yes, we can sense that there is a lot to do, and everybody here was talking about their possibilities as opposed to the barriers. And I think that hopefully speaks well for what could come from here. So on behalf of the ONeill Institute, Georgetown, our partners at the Fogarty Center, I can't thank you enough for being here, and thank all of our panelists for such an incredible day. So thank you. This is 3 days in a row. We can't go on. So thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Derek, I'd like to see you. I hope I get you. It's good that you're a professor like that, too. That's a good sign. No one better. Just Greg.